Story hook. Glass hit the floor before he finished falling. A wine cabinet. 200 pounds of mahogany and crystal gone in 1 second. And in the middle of the wreckage, a man bleeding out on marble. A baby screaming 3 feet away. This was the scene Cyril Vale walked into. His white cane touched broken glass before he even reached the room. The smell of blood hit him next. Heavy. Too heavy for the space. He moved fast. Knelt down. Found the wound. Applied pressure. Ripped fabric with one hand. And with the other, picked up the screaming baby. Calmed her in under 60 seconds. While the man on the floor was still pretending to be unconscious. Because here's what Cyril didn't know yet. The accident was fake. The blood was fake. The whole scene had been built, piece by piece the night before, by the 3 most feared men in the city. The Calder triplets. Mafia heirs. Shipping empire. The kind of family whose name makes other powerful men speak quietly. They had staged everything. To test him. To find out what a blind Omega really wanted with their brother. They watched from a security room 2 floors up. Cameras on every angle. They expected panic. They expected tears. They expected the mask to slip. Instead, Cyril stilled, lifted his fingers from the wound, brought them close to his face, and said something that made every man in that control room stop breathing. This blood smells wrong. For minutes, that's all it took. For a blind man, carrying groceries, humming to himself, thinking about a baby he'd named Junie because she arrived in June and he liked names that felt like light, to walk through a professionally staged crime scene and catch the lie. But that's not the story. The story is what came after. Because the man they thought they were testing had a father who built the very criminal infrastructure they were fighting to protect themselves from. Had knowledge, stored quietly in his memory since childhood, that could dismantle the most dangerous cartel in the city from the inside. Had been found, after 9 years of hiding in plain sight, by an enemy who had been waiting just as long. And had no idea, none, that the night he walked through that broken glass was the night the war started. Not their war. The Calders thought they were testing an Omega. They were waking up a weapon. Chapter 1. The smell of a lie. Glass exploded across the marble floor. Not gradually, not slowly, all at once. A violent, crashing thunder that shook the walls of the Calder mansion like a gunshot had gone off inside. The wine cabinet didn't just fall. It detonated. 200 pounds of polished mahogany and imported crystal meeting the floor in a single brutal moment. Red and amber liquid bled across the imported stone in long, slow rivers, and in the center of that wreckage lay Riven Calder, one arm twisted beneath him, his white dress shirt blooming with what looked like a deep, ugly wound soaking through the fabric from his ribs outward. A baby screamed, the kind of scream that cuts through your chest and doesn't let go. Hi, bro. Desperate. The kind only a baby can make when the world suddenly stops being safe. She was 3 feet from Riven's outstretched hand, sitting in her carrier on the floor, her tiny face red and crumpled, her whole body shaking with every shriek. The carrier had been positioned close to the scene, close enough to look like she had been in his arms when he went down. Anyone walking into that room would have seen catastrophe. They would have seen a powerful man bleeding out on his own floor and a baby abandoned and screaming in the middle of it. That was exactly the point. 2 floors above, in the security room that ran along the east wing of the mansion, Riven's brothers stood shoulder to shoulder in the blue-gray glow of the monitors. Cyril Calder, eldest of the triplets by 4 minutes, built like a man who had never once in his life backed down from anything, stood with his arms crossed so tight his knuckles had gone pale. Beside him, Calder, the youngest of the 3 by 11 minutes, watched the live feed with the quiet, calculating stillness of a man who spent money on information the way other men spent money on food. Essential. Non-negotiable. He's not moving enough, Cyril said flatly. It needs to look real. It looks real enough, Cade replied. The baby's doing all the work for us. On the monitor, Riven shifted slightly, adjusting the angle of his outstretched arm, keeping his face turned toward the front hallway. Right arm underneath him, left arm stretched out toward the baby's carrier. The blood capsule pressed against his side had ruptured perfectly when he hit the floor. The dark stain kept spreading, slow and convincing. The synthetic compound Cade had sourced reacting with the fabric at almost exactly the rate of real blood. Everything had been placed with the kind of precision that took time and the absence of conscience. The wine cabinet had been loosened at the base by Cade the night before, not enough to fall on its own, but enough that a single pull with both hands would bring it down in under a second. The baby had been positioned close but safe, her carrier locked into a fixed bracket that looked like nothing and held like iron. The glass had been scattered in the specific arc of a man who had grabbed at the cabinet on the way down and pulled it with him. The front door had been left unlocked at exactly 4:45. When the security feed from the block camera showed Cyril turning the corner onto Alderton Street, for minutes from the door, all that remained was waiting. In the silence between the baby's screaming, the brothers waited. Hi viewers. If someone you trusted set up a fake emergency just to test whether you really loved them, would you forgive them or walk away forever? Drop your answer in the comments right now because what Cyril does next is about to change everything you think you know about this story. The Calder name was not one you said casually in certain parts of this city. 3 generations of protected shipping routes, territory agreements enforced by fear and by loyalty in equal measure, and the kind of power that didn't need to advertise itself because everyone already knew. The triplets, Riven, Torin, and Cade, had inherited a world that treated trust as a liability and loyalty as something you verified, repeatedly, and with no apology. Riven's decision to pursue marriage with a blind Omega named Cyril Vale had sent a current of unease through the entire family structure. Not because Cyril was Omega, the Calders had no bias there. Not because he was blind. It was because no one could explain him. He had appeared in Riven's orbit 6 months ago, quiet and self-contained, running a struggling non-profit shelter for abandoned Omegas out of a rented 2-story building on the east side of the city. He asked for nothing from the Calder name, demanded nothing, didn't flinch when the family's history was mentioned and wasn't impressed when the money was visible. That combination made Torin deeply uncomfortable. And so the test. Across the city, Cyril Vale pressed his white cane into the uneven sidewalk ahead of him and kept walking. 2 grocery bags hung from his right arm. Infant formula, baby food, brown rice, a small packet of electrolyte powder because the baby had been slightly dehydrated 2 days ago and he hadn't stopped thinking about it since. His dark hair was pulled back from his face. His steps were measured, practiced, the cane moving in the smooth arc of long habit. He hummed something low and wordless under his breath, the kind of tune that has no name because it was never composed, just felt. He was thinking about Junie, the baby. 8 months old, no legal name yet because the courts moved slow and the backlog for abandoned infant cases ran 6 to 9 months. Had come to Cyril the way most of the shelter's cases came. Quietly, through a social worker connection with almost no documentation. The worker had called him at 11 at night and said only that there was a situation and that Cyril was the only person she trusted with it. He'd been at the shelter in 12 minutes. Junie had grabbed his finger that first night like it was the only solid thing in the world. He called her Junie because it was the month she arrived and because he liked names that felt like light. He reached the Calder mansion gate and pressed the security code from memory. A 6-digit sequence Riven had given him 2 months ago, before any of this was official, before the conversation about the future had become real. The gate opened smoothly. He crossed the courtyard. And the moment the front door swung inward, something hit him. Not a sound, not movement, a feeling. The charge of a room where something had happened. The air inside was different, heavier, carrying something sharp and metallic that didn't belong in a house that normally smelled like cedar and clean stone and, faintly, the coffee that was always running in the kitchen by afternoon. His cane touched glass before he expected it. He stopped. 1 second. 2. His ears pulled in the full detail of the silence around him. Then, underneath the ambient sound of the house, Junie's crying. Not distant. Not from upstairs. Close. Ground floor. The main room. Then the smell reached him fully. Iron. Thick and heavy in the air, the unmistakable chemical signature of blood. Too thick for the space. Too much volume for a small cut. Cyril moved fast. Not panicked. not stumbling. Fast and deliberate, his cane clearing the path ahead in short, precise sweeps, reading the glass distribution as he went, scattered outward from a single point, not spread by a struggle. He rounded the corner into the main room and dropped to his knees beside the sound of Riven's breathing. His hands moved immediately. Collar, jaw, the side of the neck, 2 fingers pressing in just below the ear. His fingers found Riven's face in the dark of his own vision. They were very close. Cyril's breath came controlled and quiet. Riven could feel it warm, even against the side of his jaw, against his ear. The Omega's hands moved without hesitation, feeling the pulse, reading its strength and rhythm. Riven's chest went tight. For exactly 1 second, lying in fake blood on his own floor with the whole thing still running exactly as planned, he almost forgot it was a test. Something about Cyril's hands on his face. Something about the way the Omega's touch carried no hesitation and no judgment. Just presence. Just focus. Riven. Cyril's voice was low, steady as stone. Stay with me. Can you hear me? Riven kept his eyes closed. The plan said stay unresponsive. Let the Omega panic. Let whatever was underneath the surface come out. But Cyril didn't panic. He turned toward the sound of Junie's crying, triangulated her position in under 2 seconds, and rose. He crossed to her, unclipped her carrier straps with practiced hands, finding each buckle by feel, no delay, and lifted her against his chest in one smooth motion. One hand under her back, one supporting her head. He pressed her close and began to move in slow, small circles. Not rocking hard, just swaying gently, and he murmured something against the top of her head. Low, private, just for her. The crying slowed again, then stopped. In the security room, neither brother said a word. Torin's jaw had tightened. Cade had gone completely still, his eyes moving between monitors, processing. On the screen, Cyril turned back toward Riven with Junie against his shoulder. He knelt and found the wound with his free hand. Pressed. Firm. Correct pressure for a side wound, not too light, not so heavy it would shift the position of a broken rib if there were one. He ripped the fabric with a single clean pull and used the strip to reinforce the compression, tying it with the same efficiency as someone who had done this in conditions with fewer resources and more at stake. He whispered to Riven the whole time. Then his fingers slowed. He lifted them from the wound, brought them close to his face, went very still. A second passed. Then another. His head tilted slightly. This blood smells wrong. 3 words, spoken quietly, almost to himself. In the control room above, Torin took one sharp breath. Cade turned to look at his brother, and the expression on his face was not surprise. It was something closer to confirmation. The Omega had not screamed, had not run, had not frozen or collapsed into panic or grabbed his phone and called emergency services in a blind spiral. He had walked through broken glass, calmed the baby, applied correct wound care, and caught the lie. All of it, in under 4 minutes. Chapter 2: What the Blood Gave Away. Cyril didn't move. Not right away. He stayed exactly where he was, one hand still resting near the wound, the other pressed flat against Riven's chest, feeling the rise and fall of breath that was too consistent, too metered, for a man who had just taken a violent fall and lost significant blood. Junie was quiet against his shoulder. Her small fist had found the collar of his shirt and was holding on without gripping. The kind of hold that means comfort, not fear. Riven's breathing was controlled. Too controlled. The exhales were spaced with the precision of someone who was managing them consciously, not surrendering to them. Cyril sat back slowly on his heels. He set his palm flat on the floor to one side, feeling the texture of the marble, the edges of the nearest glass shards, the distribution of moisture from the spilled wine. Then he turned his face slightly toward the ceiling, the way he did when he was organizing information. "You can stop," he said quietly. No accusation, no anger sharpening the edges of it. Just 3 words, clear and level, dropped into the silence of that room like they weighed nothing and everything at the same time. Riven opened his eyes. This was not in the script. The script was to stay down, unresponsive, until the Omega either broke down or revealed something. Reached for his phone, started taking photographs, called someone. That was the theory. Panic exposes motive. But Cyril was looking at a point slightly past Riven's shoulder, not meeting his eyes, because the geometry of vision didn't work for him the same way. But his gaze was close enough that the intention was clear. His posture was completely composed. Like a man who had already processed the full situation, measured it, accepted it, and moved directly into the part where you figure out what to do next. You didn't have to test me, Cyril said. The words were quiet, but the weight behind them was not small. From the control room, Cade watched the feed without blinking. He had a habit, when something surprised him, of going very still. He was very still now. Torin exhaled through his nose. He figured it out faster than any of our guys would have. He figured it out before he fully crossed the room, Cade said. The smell. He knew before he knelt down. He reached for the door handle. That is not a coincidence. That is training. Torin turned from the screen. Where are you going? To start looking. Cade said it simply. Because someone doesn't just know what synthetic hemoglobin smells like unless they've worked around it. Or worked around the real thing enough to know the difference. In the main room below, Riven had sat up. The blood stain had spread wide across his shirt and one hand. He looked at Cyril. Really looked, the way he hadn't let himself do before tonight, not fully, and said nothing for a moment. There was something in his expression that didn't have a clean name. Discomfort, maybe, but not guilt. Something closer to being seen more clearly than you expected to be, and not knowing what to do with that. Cyril was checking the room around him. His cane was still somewhere near the door. He'd left it when he moved fast, so he was working from memory and the information his other senses fed back. Glass near the cabinet base. The wine stain spreading left, which meant the cabinet had tipped from the right. The blood distribution under Riven's shirt was consistent with a capsule position mid-torso. Not a wound. He had mapped it all in the time it took Riven to sit up. How long have you been watching? Cyril asked. Long enough, Riven said. Cyril nodded slowly. Not satisfied, not resigned. Absorbing. Is she okay? Riven asked, his eyes going to Junie. She was scared. She's fine now. Cyril pressed his lips briefly to the top of the baby's head, and she made a small sound of contentment. She calms when she hears me. You moved fast, Riven said. When you went to her, she was crying. Cyril said it plainly, like that was the only explanation necessary, like no other option had even occurred to him. Riven stood. He pulled the blood-soaked fabric strip from his side and held it for a moment, then set it on the overturned cabinet. The mansion was quiet. Outside, rain had started, soft, irregular, tapping against the tall windows like a metronome with no particular rhythm. Why aren't you angry? Riven asked. Cyril considered this the same way he considered everything, without rushing it. He shifted Junie to a slightly different position against his shoulder, and she settled in without complaint. What would anger fix? He asked. You were tested like you were. Like I was an unknown, Cyril said. No sharpness in it. Just the word. Yes, I know that's how I appeared to you. And you're an unknown to me too, Riven. I don't think the testing is the problem. He paused for just a beat. I think the fact that you had to do it this way is the problem. Riven looked at him for a long time. Then, instead of answering, he moved toward the door. Not to leave, but to guide Cyril around the glass. He reached out and his hand found Cyril's wrist instead of his arm, closed around it by reflex, and the momentum of it pulled Cyril a half step forward. Their bodies nearly came together. Cyril's free hand came up fast and caught Riven's jacket lapel to stabilize himself. Both of them stopped. The baby was between them, warm, sleepy, unbothered. But the rest of it was anything but unbothered. The proximity, the heat. Cyril's jaw had tightened, just slightly. Not from fear, from awareness. The kind of awareness that announces itself and refuses to be politely ignored. Riven released his wrist almost immediately. Neither of them stepped back right away. A few seconds passed in that narrow space between them. Then Riven stepped back. Cyril straightened and repositioned Junie on his shoulder. Neither of them said anything about it. Later, Riven sat at the kitchen island while Cyril moved through the space with the ease of someone who had mapped it carefully over months of visits. The stove, the counter, the exact position of every cabinet he'd opened before. He set a pot to warm, pulled formula from the bag he'd brought, tested the temperature with the inside of his wrist twice before being satisfied. He set Junie in the small travel seat Riven had installed on the counter, always at the same end, always secured the same way, and kept one hand near her while he worked. Riven watched him, just watched. Upstairs, Cade sat at a desk with 4 open windows on his screen and a call running on speaker. His contact in the records bureau spoke quickly. Cade wrote nothing. He never did. He had learned early that written notes were a liability in this family, and his memory was precise enough to make them unnecessary anyway. Cyril Vale, age 26, licensed non-profit director, legally blind since age 17, no living family on record, no criminal history, no outstanding debt beyond the shelter's operating costs, which were public knowledge. Verified. Clean. Too clean. Cade ended the call and pulled up a different database. One that didn't appear on any licensed registry. It pulled from archived private records, ledgers, disappearance logs, the kind of material that didn't exist in any official form anymore but had been preserved by the people who originally kept it, because information like that doesn't stop being valuable just because time passes. He typed in a single word, Vale. The results came back in under 10 seconds. Cade read the entry once, then again. He sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling. The rain was heavier now, running down the window behind him in long, shifting lines. He stood, crossed the hall, knocked once on Torin's door. "You need to see this," he said when it opened. Torin looked at him. "What?" "The Vale family." Cade carried the laptop in and set it down on the desk. They didn't just disappear from public records. They were erased. Someone went through every registry and removed them. Deliberately, professionally. He watched Torin read. That kind of erasure costs money. The kind of money that only comes from a specific kind of source. Torin read the entry in silence. Then he looked up at his brother. "Who else knows about this?" Cade shook his head. "Right now, just us." Downstairs, the kitchen smelled like warm formula and rain. Cyril had fed Junie and settled her against his chest, her eyes drooping closed. Riven was still watching him. The question he wanted to ask was sitting in the air between them like smoke. Cyril spoke first. "You're going to ask me something," he said. "I am," Riven agreed. "Ask it then. How did you learn emergency trauma care?" Cyril was quiet for a moment. He pressed one hand flat against Junie's small back, feeling her breathe. "Experience," he said finally, and he said nothing more. Chapter 3, What Darkness Remembers. He was 9 years old the first time he understood what his father actually did for a living. Not the meetings that happened after dinner behind the locked study door. Not the way certain men arrived at their house looking sharp and cautious and left looking unburdened in a way that had nothing to do with joy. Not even the long equations his father wrote on chalkboards in a language that was half numbers and half something else. Diagrams of systems, pressure points, lines of force that Cyril had eventually understood weren't about engineering at all. It was the day a man arrived at their front gate with a knife. The knife wasn't hidden. The man was not subtle about it. He stood at the gate in the middle of a Wednesday afternoon holding it at his side and said a name. His father's name. Loudly enough to hear from the upstairs window where Cyril had been doing homework. His father had walked outside. Not with a weapon. Not with backup. With 3 sentences, spoken quietly enough that Cyril couldn't hear them from the window. The man put the knife away. He left. Cyril had never forgotten it. Not the knife, not the man's face, not the way his father had walked back inside and said nothing about it. Just asked if Cyril wanted juice. What had stayed with him was the 3 sentences. The certainty that the right words, said the right way, could make someone with a knife walk away. His father, Vale, had built something rare in the world he occupied. A reputation not for violence, but for architecture. He designed strategy the way other men design structures, from the foundation up, with load-bearing logic and no wasted material and a deep understanding of what would fail under pressure and what would hold. He worked for an underground alliance whose full name Cyril had never heard spoken aloud in a single sentence. He kept the balance. He mapped where things would break before they broke. He was not a soldier. He was the person the soldiers reported to. And then one morning when Cyril was 17, he woke up and his father was gone. Not taken. Not dead, as far as anyone could confirm. Gone. Like a word erased so completely from a page that not even the texture of the paper remembered the pressure of the pen. 3 days later, crossing a street near the university at 7 in the morning, a car hit him. The part that stayed with him about that moment was the silence before it. He had heard nothing. No braking. No horn. The car had been running too quietly and he had been tired and carrying his school bag and looking down, and then the impact and then nothing for 4 days. He woke up in a hospital with both eyes bandaged. The doctor who spoke to him was professional and careful and said the words permanent optic nerve damage, the way you say something you've had to say to people before and have learned not to dress up. Cyril had processed it from inside a deep, controlled stillness that he later understood was shock. Then he had asked for a glass of water. And begun. Now, in the Calder mansion kitchen, with rain pressing against the windows and Junie asleep against his chest, Cyril moved through the space with the ease of someone who had spent years converting loss into fluency. He knew exactly where the refrigerator handle was, knew the height of the counter to the inch, knew that there were 7 steps between the sink and the stove and that the third one had a slightly different sound if you were carrying weight. His hearing had sharpened over the years in ways that even he didn't fully understand. Not supernatural. Not some compensation the body invented to make the story cleaner. Just the raw result of paying attention when attention was all you had. The synthetic blood had registered wrong to him before he'd even fully knelt beside Riven. The compound had the right visual behavior, the spread pattern, the dark oxidation along the edges, but it carried a chemical flatness that real blood doesn't have. Real blood has complexity. It carries iron and protein and something organic underneath, something alive even after it leaves the body. The substitute didn't have that. He hadn't announced this knowledge. There was no reason to. He could feel Riven's weight in the doorway now, the specific signature of another person's presence in a space, the subtle air pressure change, the small sounds of breathing and weight shift. He had known Riven was there for about 4 minutes before he said anything. "You've been there a while," Cyril said, without turning. Riven made a sound, almost a laugh, quiet and involuntary. "You counted." "I don't count. I just notice." Cyril tested the formula temperature against his wrist, turned down the flame 2 degrees. "You want to ask me something?" A pause. "How did you learn emergency trauma care?" Riven asked, the same question he'd circled back to, because the answer from earlier hadn't been enough and they both knew it. Cyril kept his hands moving. He lifted Junie from the travel seat and settled her against his shoulder before offering the bottle. She took it without opening her eyes. Her small fingers pressed against his hand. Not gripping, just touching. Present. "Experience," he said again. It was the truth. Just not the complete truth. The complete truth was that Vale had not raised a strategist's child and left the emergency protocols to chance. Cyril had learned wound management at 12, sitting on a kitchen stool while his father walked him through scenarios with the same even patience he applied to everything. He had learned field stabilization at 14, not because his father expected him to need it, but because knowledge like that was worth more than any other kind in certain situations. He had learned to identify the smell of real blood from synthetic and chemical blood substitutes at 15, because there were people in the world who used them for theater and you needed to know which situation you were actually in. What his father had not told him was what he had actually been preparing him for. Riven stepped fully into the kitchen. He crossed to the cabinet above and to the right of the counter, reaching past Cyril for a glass. The kitchen was narrow. There were maybe 8 inches between them. Riven's arm passed close enough that Cyril felt the shift in the air. the warmth of a body at close range, the faint cedar and something drier smell of him. Cyril went completely still, not with fear, not with anything that needed to be managed. Just with the specific kind of stillness that comes when your body registers something and you have not yet decided what to do about it. Neither of them moved for a moment. Then Riven's hand found the glass, and he stepped back. The space between them returned to something reasonable. Cyril let out a slow, quiet breath and pressed his lips to the top of Junie's head. She made a small, satisfied sound around the bottle. Across the city, in a building that appeared on no licensed property listing, Deshawn Crest sat at a long table under a single lamp. The table held one folder. The folder held photographs, archived records, and a handwritten timeline that covered 12 years. He was not old, mid-50s maybe, but he looked like a man who had lived inside high-stakes decisions for so long that his face had permanently adopted their weight. He picked up the alert from his phone and read it again. Riven Calder, Triplet heir, publicly pursuing an omega named Cyril Vale. Blind since age 17. He set the phone face down. The name Vale had not appeared on his radar in 9 years. 9 years since the erasure. 9 years since Devlin had stepped back or been stepped back from the alliance, and every trace of his existence had been professionally removed from the accessible record. Deshawn looked at the ceiling for a long moment. Then he smiled. Not with warmth. "Perfect," he said quietly, and reached for his phone. Chapter 4, Who's Really Watching? The answer was no. Cyril said it the way he said most things, without hesitation, without apology, and without leaving any visible gap for negotiation to slip through. Riven had laid the case out carefully. Threat assessment, territorial escalation, the specific intelligence they'd gathered on the cartel's recent movements. He'd framed it as the logical choice, the smart move, the thing any reasonable person would do when the alternative was being exposed in a building with no armed security and 11 vulnerable people inside. Cyril had listened to the full presentation, then said no. "You can't stay unprotected while this is in motion," Riven said. His voice was level but barely. "I won't be unprotected," Cyril said. "The shelter has locks. It has protocols. It has a network of people who look out for each other. That's not the same as. There are 11 Omegas in that building right now." He said it quietly. 3 of them are under 20. 2 came in last month with no documentation and injuries that were older than the ones they could explain. One of them has a 6-month-old of her own. He folded his hands on the kitchen table. "I'm not leaving them." Torin, standing near the window with his coffee, said nothing. He had learned quickly over the past several weeks that getting into a reasoned debate with Cyril Vale was a waste of the kind of energy you couldn't easily replace. The man didn't respond to volume or pressure. He responded to logic, and his version of logic didn't have the same emotional architecture that most people's did. Cade had not been invited to this particular conversation and had arrived anyway, standing at the door with the specific expression of a man who had information he was withholding for the right moment. "At minimum," Riven said, "let us put someone on the building." "You can do that," Cyril said. "I can't stop you." But the women inside that shelter didn't come there to be watched by armed men they've never met. Most of them came from situations where that exact image, a man posted at a door, means something very different from protection. He paused. "If they see your guard and they don't trust it, they'll leave. And if they leave, the 2 without documentation have nowhere to go." Torin turned from the window. "You understand what you are to the people who want to come at us." Cyril looked toward him. "Leverage," he said. "Yes, I've understood that for a while. And knowing that doesn't change anything for you." "It concerns me significantly," Cyril said simply. "But the shelter still needs to run. Fear doesn't change what the work requires." Cade made a sound in the doorway that wasn't quite a laugh. Torin looked at him with an expression that said they would be discussing this later. That evening, Cyril walked home alone. He always walked. The route was mapped in his bones by now, the uneven sidewalk repair near the crosswalk on 5th, the 3-second delay on the traffic light at the corner of Ashton and Meridian, the way the wind off the river shifted direction right before the turn onto his block. Rain was expected but hadn't arrived yet. The city smelled like warm asphalt and someone's takeout 2 doors down and the specific metal and whetstone smell that comes right before rain falls. He was 3 blocks from the shelter when the feeling arrived. Not a sound. Not yet. A displacement. The specific kind his body had learned to read over years of navigating a world it couldn't see. The way another person's movement disturbs the air even at 20 feet. Especially from behind, where the disturbance travels forward instead of spreading outward. His steps and the other person's steps were 2 in sync. Deliberate synchrony. The kind that takes work. Someone was following him and trying hard not to be heard. Cyril didn't stop. He adjusted his pace, shorter steps, slightly slower, and listened with his full attention. The presence confirmed itself. Then a second further back and to the right. 2 of them. He reached the alley between the pharmacy and the shuttered laundry, cut left without hesitation, pressed his back to the brick wall inside the entrance, and went completely still. The footsteps passed on the sidewalk outside, slowed, stopped briefly. 30 seconds of silence. They moved on. Cyril counted to 45, then stepped back out and kept walking. He did not call Riven. He was half a block from the shelter door when a hand came out of a recessed doorway and grabbed his arm. Hard. His cane swung on instinct, the motion fluid, fast, years of muscle memory making the decision before he did. But the grip was iron, and a voice said his name low and very close. "It's me, Riven." Cyril exhaled. His fingers, which had already found and closed around the lapel of Riven's jacket in the same instant he tried to swing the cane, didn't let go. He could feel Riven's heartbeat against the back of his hand through the fabric. Fast and hard. The rhythm of someone who had been running. They were pressed together in the narrow space between the wall and the recessed doorway. Rain just beginning to fall at the edge of the alcove in a quiet, insistent curtain. Riven had his free hand flat against the wall beside Cyril's head. Neither of them moved. "There were 2, Cyril said quietly. "Behind me. I know. They pulled off when you ducked into the alley." Riven's voice was low and close. "They've been running surveillance on your route for 3 days. Cyril processed this. His fingers stayed in the jacket. "You've had people watching me. I've had people on the perimeter of the area. You walk through it. That's not the same thing and you know it." "No," Riven said. "It's not." He didn't move back from the wall. The rain was picking up outside their alcove. "But you're still standing here." Cyril could feel the warmth of Riven's breath against the side of his face. Could feel the specific tension in the man's body, not readiness, not threat. Relief. The kind of relief that shakes you slightly after the fact, when you realize how close something was. Riven's whole frame carried it. "You're afraid for me," Cyril said. Riven was quiet for a moment. "Don't make that sound simple," he said. Cyril almost smiled. "Just the corner of it." He turned his face slightly away and listened to the rain and the distant sound of a car 2 streets over. "The people following me," he said. "Do you have a name?" "We're running it down." Cyril nodded once. He used Riven's arm to step back away from the wall, oriented himself toward the shelter, and began walking. "Go home, Riven." "Cyril, I know you're close now," he said without looking back. "That's enough for tonight." Riven watched him walk all the way to the door. Watched him press the code. Watched the light go green and the door open and Cyril disappear inside without looking back. He stood in the rain for a minute. Then his phone buzzed. "Cade." 2 words. "Call me." "The 2 men running surveillance tonight," Cade said before Riven finished saying hello. "One of them has a documented prior connection to the Ochoa cartel, specifically to their logistics coordinator, the man who manages their personnel movement." A pause. "Which means this isn't about us, Riven. Or it's not only about us. They're watching him specifically. They went out of their way to put 2 people on a route that leads to a nonprofit shelter." Riven stood in the rain and said nothing. "That's targeted," Cade continued. "That's someone who already knows about Cyril and has decided he matters." 2 blocks away, at a 3rd-floor window overlooking the alley, a man set a case on a folding table and opened it. His movements were practiced and efficient. He had done this many times in many cities, and he had never once needed more than 30 minutes from arrival to readiness. He pulled the rifle out piece by piece and began assembling it in the dark. Chapter 5: The Sound Before the Shot. The event had been Cyril's idea. 6 weeks of planning, built entirely on a budget that had no right to support the ambition of it. Volunteers had distributed flyers by hand across 4 neighborhoods because the shelter's printing budget was $11 and shared access to a library printer. 3 local restaurants had donated food. 2 of them because Cyril had personally walked in and asked, and there was something in the way he asked that made people agree before they'd finished thinking about it. He didn't perform need. He didn't use the blindness as leverage. He just explained what the shelter was for and what the event would do and waited, and somehow that waiting felt more like certainty than any sales pitch would have. The shelter's main room had been rearranged the evening before. Chairs in rows, donation table near the door, a small pamphlet display that Cyril's oldest volunteer, a woman named Miss Odessa who had been with him since the first week, had arranged and rearranged 4 times until it felt right to her. 40 people came. That was more than the last 3 events combined. Cyril moved through the room the way water moves through a space it knows. Not slowly, not carefully, but with the ease of someone who has mapped this territory so completely that the mapping has stopped being conscious. He tracked positions by sound. He navigated around chairs by air pressure and the small signals of other bodies moving. He answered questions from a city council aide, thanked a donor by her first name, and knew without asking which volunteer had brought the extra coffee and which one had forgotten the napkins. Riven stood near the back wall with his hands in his jacket pockets. He had not been invited. He had been told the time and the address and shown up anyway, and Cyril had responded by handing him a name tag and saying nothing except that the donation box was by the front table and volunteers appreciated genuine help more than supervision. Riven had stood near the back wall. Torin and Cade were outside. They had brought 2 additional guards without mentioning this to Cyril. For total, distributed at entry points and sight lines, nothing visible, nothing that would disturb the room or make the shelter's guests uncomfortable. Cade had personally overseen the positioning. The event had been running 42 minutes. Riven had moved twice, once to a slightly better angle on the parking structure across the street, once back toward the center wall. Neither movement had been driven by a specific signal. It was something else. The background frequency of his own training, the low-grade alertness that had been built into him over 15 years of living inside a world where the moment that looks calmest is often the moment before everything changes. He wasn't looking at the window when Cyril stopped. He heard it, the pause, the silence between one sentence and the next that lasted just a beat longer than normal. Across the room, Cyril was mid-conversation with the foster coordination director. He stopped. His head moved slightly. His weight shifted onto his front foot. Then he moved. No cane. He'd set it against the donation table earlier. He navigated pure from memory and signal, cutting across the room in a straight line, and when he reached Riven he grabbed his arm with both hands and pulled. Hard. Down. The window behind them exploded inward. The sound arrived a half-second after the glass. The crack of the shot, traveling behind its own damage the way it does at distance. The bullet hit the far wall and took out a framed photograph that had been hanging there since the shelter opened. The room erupted. Chairs knocked sideways. People hit the floor. Someone was screaming and someone else was shouting for doors, and Riven already had Cyril down with one arm hard across his back. Both of them flat against the floor, glass falling around them in slow, small pieces. "I've got you," Riven said against his ear. "Don't move." Cyril was breathing fast. Controlled fast. Not panic, just the body accounting for what just happened. His hands were flat on the floor. His jaw was set. "There were 2 shots," he said. "1, Riven said. 2. The second didn't break glass. It hit wood. Left of us. Somewhere near the base of the wall." Riven looked left. The baseboard along the far wall near the donation table had a clean puncture in it. Fresh, sharp edges that hadn't been there when he'd walked past it earlier. 2 shots. He grabbed the earpiece. Cade. 2 shooters. First one, parking structure across the street, 3rd floor or above. Second shooter west-facing, hit interior wood. He was already calculating angles. East team move. West team sweep. Moving, Kate said. Around the room, Cyril's volunteers were doing exactly what they were supposed to do. Moving people low and toward the interior hallway, away from windows, speaking quietly and steadily. No stampede. No collapse. The training had come from Cyril himself, passed on in a casual conversation 6 months ago, framed as standard emergency protocol. Junie was upstairs in the back room with a volunteer named Kezia who had Cyril's emergency number and a written protocol that he had personally given her on her first week. That room had no windows. Riven kept his hand on Cyril's back. Still, steady. The first shot, Cyril said against the floor, voice low and even. Before the glass broke. About 3 seconds before I heard a click. Small and metallic. High up, outside. Riven turned his head to look at him. You heard the scope adjustment. I don't know what I heard. I just knew it was wrong. His hands pressed flat against the floor. Wind had been coming from the north all evening. Then it shifted east. Something clicked outside, up high. Then the glass. The shooter corrected for the wind change, Riven said. That's what it sounds like now, Cyril said. Then, I just knew the click was wrong. Outside, Cade's team had reached the parking structure. The west team was on the second position. Riven's phone buzzed. First shooter ran. No trace. He's gone, Riven said. Cyril sat up slowly. His hands moved over himself in a fast, efficient check. Arms, ribs, neck, face. Finding nothing. Then he turned and did the same thing to Riven. Both palms against his jacket, then his collar, then the side of his neck. Checking for blood that shouldn't be there, for injuries that shock sometimes hides. You're not hit, Cyril said. Riven realized he had been holding his breath. Neither are you, he said. His hand, the one that had stayed on Cyril's back through all of it, moved slightly. His fingers settled against the fabric at Cyril's side and stayed there. The room was breathing again. Slowly, people were rising. The volunteers were doing a count. Kezia appeared at the top of the stairs with Junie against her chest, and Cyril tracked the sound of the baby's voice immediately and turned toward it. She's okay, Kezia said, coming down. She slept through the whole thing. Cyril took Junie, held her close. The baby pressed her face against his neck and made a small, warm sound. Outside, Torin appeared in the broken window frame from street level. He looked at his brother, looked at Cyril, then looked at Cade, who had arrived at his shoulder. This Omega might save our lives one day, Torin said quietly. He was not asking. Cade was already back on his phone. That night, Riven drove Cyril back to the mansion. Junie was asleep in her carrier in the back. The city moved past the windows. Wet streets, amber light. The rain that had returned and hadn't decided how serious it wanted to be. Cyril was quiet most of the drive. His hands were folded in his lap and his face was turned slightly toward the window, the way it sometimes was when he was organizing information rather than resting. The click I heard, he said finally. That's a trained adjustment. That's not someone who picked up a rifle last month. No, Riven said. And 2 shooters means coordination. Resources. Planning. Yes. Cyril was quiet for another moment. Then, this isn't about your business territory, is it? Riven kept his eyes on the road. We're running profiles tonight, he said. We'll know more by morning. By morning, they knew. The equipment recovered from the parking structure. A single lens cap left on the 3rd floor stairwell, scratched with a serial number that had been filed down incorrectly, came back from 2 independent contacts with the same result. Ochoa Cartel, Eastern Division, coordinated and sanctioned at the command level. Not freelance, not opportunistic, deliberate. In a sealed room on the other side of the city, Deshawn Crest received the photograph taken outside the shelter earlier that evening, before the shots, before the chaos. Shot from a distance, slightly blurred at the edges but clear enough. Cyril moving through the room with his head tilted at that specific angle, tracking sound, reading the space. Deshawn studied the photograph for a long time. He set it down carefully, picked up his encrypted phone, dialed a number that had no name attached to it in his contacts. When the line connected, all he said was this: "He's awake. Move everything forward." The line went quiet, and in the back seat of Riven's car, asleep in her carrier, Junie's small fist was closed loosely around nothing, the way babies hold things that aren't there yet, but will be. Chapter 6. You're shaking. The storm came in fast. 1 hour the sky was dark gray and still holding itself together. The next, rain was coming sideways off the harbor, pressing against every window in the Calder mansion like it had made a decision about the building and intended to follow through. The kind of storm that doesn't start gradually. It arrives, all at once. The wind picked up half a second before the first real wave hit the glass, and then the lights in the mansion flickered once, twice, and went out in a single clean cut. Backup power was supposed to kick in. Didn't. In the kitchen, Riven reached for the nearest light switch by reflex, pressed it twice and got nothing. He had a flashlight somewhere. The back pantry, third drawer from the left. He started toward it, already planning the route around the island. "Don't move," Cyril said. "You'll step on the ladle." Riven stopped, looked down. The ladle he'd left on the floor after dinner, the one he'd meant to pick up 3 separate times, was exactly where his next step would have put his full weight. Cyril was standing at the counter with Junie propped against his left shoulder, one hand supporting her back. He had not moved, had not grabbed for anything in the dark, had not done any of the reflexive things that people do when light disappears. Reach for walls, slow their steps, wait for their eyes to adjust. He had simply said don't move with the calm of someone who already knew where everything was. "Flashlight," Riven said. "Back pantry, third drawer." "I know where it is," Cyril said. "I've known where it is since my 4th visit." He moved across the kitchen without hesitation. His feet knew the floor. His hand found the pantry door, the drawer, the flashlight. All of it in sequence, all of it fast. He set it on the counter and clicked it on, then positioned it in the wide cup of the fruit bowl at a downward angle so the light bounced off the ceramic and spread soft and diffuse across most of the room. Then he turned back to the stove like the power outage had been an interruption and not a crisis. Riven watched him from the center of the kitchen. "You need to say something to me," Cyril said. His back was to Riven. But he said it with the certainty of someone who could feel a weight in a room without needing to see the person carrying it. "The fake accident," Riven said. Cyril kept his hands on the pot handle, adjusted the flame. "Go ahead. I want to say it without excuses around it." Riven put both hands flat on the island counter. "We built the scene, the cabinet, the blood capsule, the baby's placement near enough to look like she'd been in my arms when I fell. All of it. My brothers were watching from the security room, and it was my decision, not something they pushed me into. I decided it." He stopped. "It was wrong." A pause. Cyril set the spoon down carefully on the rest beside the stove. "Did the test give you what you needed?" he asked. "That's the question you've been holding," Riven said. "Since the night it happened." Riven moved away from the island. He went to the window, looked at the rain moving in horizontal sheets against the glass, then turned back. The kitchen was warm in the flashlight's reflected glow. Junie made a small sound, not unhappy, just present, tracking the ambient noise of the storm with the particular alertness of a baby who has learned that new sounds are information. "It gave me what I already had," Riven said. "That's the part one keep coming back to. I knew you weren't after the money. I knew the name didn't impress you. I had watched you long enough to know both of those things, and I still set the test." He crossed his arms. "Because knowing isn't the same as trusting, and I've never been good at the second part." "You were raised in a world where trust costs people their lives," Cyril said. "That's not a character flaw. That's a survival response. Don't make it easier than it is." "I'm not." Cyril turned from the stove. He faced in Riven's general direction. Not quite at him, but close. "I'm saying I understand why you did it, and I'm asking if the answer changed anything. Because if you walked away from that night still unsure, still watching me for the wrong move, then we have a problem that's bigger than what the Ochoa cartel is planning. Riven looked at him for a long moment. The rain pressed the windows. Junie settled against Cyril's shoulder and closed her eyes. It changed everything, Riven said. Something shifted in Cyril's posture. Subtle. The kind of thing you'd miss if you weren't paying attention. Not relief exactly. More like the quiet release of something that had been held at careful tension for weeks. He turned back to the stove. Good, he said. They ate late that night, after Junie was down and the storm had hit its peak. The mansion's backup generator finally kicked in around 9 and the main lights came back on. But by then they'd settled into the rhythm of the flashlight kitchen and neither of them reached for the overhead switch. Across the city, the Ochoa cartel was not having a quiet evening. 3 of their eastern warehouses had been flagged in a routine port authority sweep that was not routine at all. It had been triggered by an anonymous tip to a contact in the harbor logistics office. A tip that had originated from Calder's secure line at 7 that morning. 2 of Soto's logistics contacts had stopped returning calls in the past 48 hours. Both had gone unreachable in the specific way that means someone reached them first, not the way that means something bad happened to them. The distinction mattered. Soto was professional enough to read it correctly, which meant he knew the Calders were moving. In the mansion's second-floor office, Torin was running 2 calls simultaneously, which he did the way he did most things, with complete compartmentalization and no visible strain. Cade sat at the far end of the work table with his laptop and 3 physical documents spread in a flat arc in front of him. One of those documents was a financial trace he'd been building for 6 days. He'd pushed it through 3 shell companies and 6 accounts before it went cold in a routing structure that was designed to absorb backward searches. He had then approached it from a different direction. Not forward from the source, backward from the timing. What he found at the far end of that reverse trace was a name he did not recognize. That alone was significant. In 7 years of intelligence work for the family, Cade had built a database in his own memory that covered most of the active players in the city's underground economy. An unfamiliar name meant either new entry or deep cover. He photographed the name and sent it to his Geneva contact. Then he waited. Downstairs, the power came back on at 11:43. The kitchen filled with full light. Riven had not moved from the island. Cyril was still at the stove. He had made tea after dinner and was warming a second cup now, moving through the kitchen with the unhurried ease that had stopped surprising Riven weeks ago and had started doing something else entirely. Something he didn't have a clean word for yet. The storm was pulling back. Still raining, but the violence of it had passed. The harbor wind had dropped. Outside the kitchen window, the trees in the courtyard had stopped bending and were just moving now. Slow, normal, unbothered. Riven pushed off from the island. He crossed the kitchen. He stopped behind Cyril. His hands found Cyril's shoulders, not gripping, not steering. Just there. The weight of both palms settling on the fabric with a gentleness that was deliberate. The space between Cyril's back and Riven's chest was less than an inch. Cyril went still. Not tensed. Still. The way he went still when he was paying full attention to something. Riven could feel the warmth of the omega through the fabric. Could feel the rise and fall of his breathing. Steady. Even. "You're shaking," Cyril said quietly. Riven's hands went motionless. It was the truth. Not badly, not visible from across a room, but present in the small muscles of his hands and forearms, in the tendons at the base of his wrists. The specific tremor that shows up after sustained adrenaline finally leaves a body that's been running on it for 12 hours. "Today," Riven said. His voice came out lower than he intended. "At the shelter. The window." "I know," Cyril said. "I was on the wrong side of the room. I know. When the glass," he stopped, pressed the sentence down. "I saw the angle of the shot and I knew where it came from and I knew I was on the wrong side." Cyril turned slightly, not fully, just a quarter turn, enough to shift the geometry between them. Junie was upstairs now with Kezia. Just the 2 of them in the kitchen. Riven's hands were still on his shoulders. "You got there," Cyril said. "Before the second shot. You got to me." He said it the same way he said most true things, simply, directly, with no softening and no performance. That's the only part that matters now. Riven exhaled, long and slow. Because I almost lost you today, he said. The words came out before he'd made a decision about them. Cyril didn't answer, but he turned back toward the stove, and Riven's hands stayed on his shoulders. And neither of them addressed the space between their bodies, which had closed somewhere in the last 30 seconds to something that had no practical explanation other than that it wanted to be that way. They stood like that for a while. The kitchen was warm and bright and quiet. In the East Wing office, Cade's phone buzzed with a response from Geneva. He read the message twice. The name he'd circled was connected to a financial structure that had been completely dormant for 9 years and 3 months. The last active transaction on record was dated 6 months before the Vale family disappeared from every accessible public and private database in the city. Cade set the phone down and sat very still. Then he picked it up again and opened a new file. Chapter 7, The Mole Speaks in Numbers. The meeting had been called for 7 in the morning. By 6:45, Cade had already adjusted the room. He'd moved 3 chairs to positions that gave him direct sightlines to both entry doors. He'd shifted the main conference table 4 inches to the east so that anyone entering from the hallway would be walking toward the window light rather than away from it. He'd placed a glass of water at each seat and a notepad at none. He didn't want anyone taking notes. Notes leave a building. Information should leave through mouths and in controlled directions, not in writing that ends up in pockets. Torin arrived at 6:58, looked at the chair placement, said nothing. Riven arrived at 7 with Cyril beside him. The 6 senior members of the Calder operation filed in over the next 3 minutes. These were not peripheral figures, they were the people who made things run. Ellison Pruitt, financial director, 16 years with the family. 2 territorial managers who between them controlled every logistics node on the eastern and southern approaches. The head of internal security. 2 operations coordinators who handled personnel movement and supply chain verification. All of them had been in the family's inner circle for a minimum of 8 years. All of them held clearance at the highest level. All of them registered Cyril's presence at the end of the table with varying degrees of visible reaction. A few kept their faces clean. A few didn't. "He's observing," Riven said, before anyone could frame a question. "That's all you need." The meeting began. Cade walked them through the full picture, the Ochoa cartel's recent movements, the surveillance on Cyril's route, the sniper equipment trace, the Delray financial bleed, the Geneva connection. He spoke in the efficient, layered style of someone who had organized large amounts of intelligence many times and understood the difference between telling people everything and telling people what they needed. He gave them the full picture. He gave it clean. Cyril sat at the far end of the table with his hands folded and his cane against the adjacent chair. He asked no questions for the first 43 minutes. He sat very still. His fingers moved occasionally. Not restless, just the small, grounded motion of a person processing at depth. His head tilted twice. The first time when Cade mentioned the specific timing of the first shell company formation. The second time when Pruitt, walking through the financial reconciliation summary, described the gap in the last quarterly account. "Go back to the reconciliation gap," Cyril said. Pruitt looked at him, then at Riven. Riven nodded. "The gap is approximately 91,000 over a 6-week window," Pruitt said. "It falls within the variance threshold we allow for operational cost fluctuation, so it cleared our standard review without." "What's the approval cycle on that variance threshold?" Cyril asked. "Monthly, first of the month." "And the gap falls in which specific weeks?" Pruitt checked his documents. "Weeks 2 and 4, both of the last 2 months." Cyril was quiet. "Every other week," he said. "Alternating. Not clustered around a single event. Not distributed randomly. Alternating." A brief pause. "That's a transfer rhythm. Someone is moving money in a pattern deliberately sized to land inside your normal variance window. They know your reconciliation schedule. They know your tolerance threshold. They've been using your own accounting architecture as cover." He let that sit for a moment. "They're inside this operation," he said, "or they have a source who is." The silence that followed had physical weight. Torrens' expression didn't change. Riven's jaw tightened. Barely, but Cyril would have read it from the shift in his breathing if not the look. The 6 operational members produced the kind of carefully managed non-reactions that were themselves telling, because controlled faces mean people who are used to being watched and have already learned not to show what they're thinking. Cross-reference access logs, Cyril said, directing this toward Cade. Personnel with both financial system access and physical building presence during those specific Week 2 and Week 4 windows. Both conditions together. The overlap narrows the pool significantly. Cade was already opening his laptop. 12 minutes and 40 seconds later, Riven counted. Cade said a name. Marcus Del Rey. Territorial Logistics Coordinator. 8 years with the family. 3rd-tier clearance. Access to the financial tracking system through an administrative login that had been granted 18 months prior for a temporary reporting project and quietly forgotten when the project ended. He was sitting 4 seats down from Riven. He was 51 years old. He had a daughter in college and a house in the Westover neighborhood and had attended 3 Calder family events in the past year and never once acted like a man with a second paycheck coming in from outside. Torrens stood up. What happened in the 7 minutes that followed was not the kind of thing that goes into documents. Del Rey was removed from the room by 2 members of Torrens' personal detail. His access was revoked before his feet hit the hallway. His phone was taken. His home address cross-referenced against known Ochoa secondary contacts returned 2 overlapping names within the hour, both from the Eastern Division's logistics support network. He had not been embedded by Soto recently. He had been embedded 2 years ago, before any of the current tension, before the surveillance on Cyril's route, before any of it was visible. Soto had been planning this for a long time. When the room had cleared and only the brothers and Cyril remained, Riven picked up his coat from the back of his chair and crossed to Cyril's end of the table. He laid the coat over Cyril's shoulders the way he had done once before, without asking, without announcing it. His hand rested near Cyril's collarbone. Not moving, just there. Cyril pulled the coat closed with one hand. You already knew someone in the room was feeding information, Riven said. I suspected a pattern, Cyril said. The person was a conclusion, not a starting point. You exposed a 2-year mole in under an hour. I noticed an accounting rhythm that didn't match organic variance. The rest was geometry. He paused. Your people were looking for a number that didn't belong. I was listening for a pattern that fit too well. Those are different problems. Riven pulled out the chair beside him and sat down. Morning light was coming through the east window now, thin, winter pale, falling across the table in long, flat lines that lit the dust in the air above it. Who taught you this? Riven asked. Cyril considered it. Someone who understood that the most dangerous thing in any system isn't the person who breaks the rules, he said. It's the person who uses the rules themselves as cover. He stood, picked up his cane. What do you know about Aurelio Soto's history? Before he built the Eastern Division. Riven looked at him. He started with nothing, street-level operation in his mid-20s. Built it over 15 years into what it is now. No legitimate ties, no front businesses, entirely underground. Known for long-form planning. He sets things in motion months in advance and doesn't activate until conditions are exactly right. He paused. Why? Cyril was already walking toward the door. Because the way he's coming at your family isn't a territory dispute, he said, not turning back. It's layered and it's personal and it has a different shape. The surveillance, the financial bleed, the sniper at a charity event attended by an Omega running a shelter. He stopped in the doorway. He's not after your shipping routes, Riven. He's after something specific. And he was willing to spend months of preparation and real resources to get a look at it from close range. He walked out. Torrens stayed in the doorway behind Riven and watched him go. Then he looked at his brother. Are you, Torrens said, with the specific flatness he used when a question was not rhetorical, actually sure that you're the one protecting him? Riven had no answer for that, which was itself an answer. Chapter 8. Everything before the war. The intelligence came in 3 pieces in the early hours of Thursday morning, from 3 different sources who didn't know about each other, which was how the best intelligence usually arrived, not assembled by one person with a bias, but converging from independent directions toward the same point. The first piece came from a harbor contact. Unusual container movement at the East Dock, 3 in the morning, a route with no matching logged manifest. The second came from Cade's Geneva contact. A large payment, recent, routed to a paper logistics firm, timed to the week before the sniper at the shelter. The third came from Cyril. He had written it out the night before on the back of a folder, in the shorthand he used when he was working something through a loan, a private notation system that had taken Riven 2 weeks to realize was not random. It was precise, abbreviated, layered, and logical. He set it on the kitchen table at 6 in the morning without saying anything about it. Just left it there and made coffee. Riven read it while the coffee was still brewing. Then he called Torin. What Cyril had built was a reconstruction of Soto's probable next move, built backward from what Soto would have needed to put in place to support it. He had worked from everything available. The briefings, Cade's financial data, the surveillance timing, the sniper's tactical choices at the shelter, the behavior of a specific kind of strategic mind that Cyril understood with the particular intimacy of someone who had been raised to understand it. 3 objectives. Sequential. The financial bleed was not theft. It was positioning, moving liquid capital into external locations that could be rapidly accessed after a disruption in the primary operation. The surveillance on Cyril's route was not just reconnaissance on a target. It was operational mapping, the shelter's hours, volunteer schedules, peak and low occupancy windows, the exact gap in security coverage between 9 and 11 on Tuesday mornings when the overnight volunteer left and the day shift hadn't arrived. The sniper at the fundraiser was not an execution attempt. Cyril had written this in underlined shorthand on the 3rd page. He had written, "If Soto wanted me dead, I would be dead. He is not missing. He is measuring response time, measuring who moved, from where, in what direction, and how fast, measuring whether the Calders had identified his financial channel, measuring whether the people protecting the target were predictable. All of it infrastructure, all of it preparation, for something coming in the next 4 to 7 days." When Torin read the reconstruction, he sat down slowly and stared at it for a long time. "He predicted the attack before our own intelligence," Torin said. "He predicted it before anyone," Cade said. "And the harbor report matches the eastern vector he flagged. The financial timeline matches the preparation phase. This is not an educated guess. This is someone reading strategic intent from behavioral evidence." He closed the folder. His father trained him for this. They spent the next 8 hours restructuring everything. Torin redirected 2 security teams to the eastern approaches, repositioning them at angles that looked like standard rotation and were not. Cade locked the financial systems and restructured access on the reconciliation tracking so that any future bleed attempt would trigger an immediate alert rather than disappearing into variance. 3 key accounts moved into holding patterns inaccessible from any external position for a 72-hour window. Riven reorganized the mansion's defensive rotation entirely, new schedules, new handoff times, new protocols for anything involving Cyril's movements, and added a second independent security layer on the shelter's block that reported to him directly rather than through the general operations chain. Cyril spent the morning at the shelter. He ran the usual Tuesday session. Intake interviews, a group meeting for the 3 newest residents, a call with the city housing office about a case that had been stalled for 6 weeks. He did not mention what was coming. He did not change the shelter's routine in any visible way. He trusted that the preparation had been done correctly. In the afternoon, he was in the mansion's east study. He had asked for specific documents. 3 years of Ochoa cartel incident summaries, 2 of Soto's publicly documented business moves from his early expansion years, and a full breakdown of the Calder shipping network's eastern structure. Riven had looked at the request for a moment, then told Cade to get them without discussing it further. By late afternoon, Cyril had marked 4 structural weaknesses in the network's eastern approach that none of the Calder operation's own analysts had documented. He had also identified a pattern in Soto's previous territorial expansions, a specific timing signature, the way he always applied pressure in 2 places simultaneously before committing resources to a third, and traced that pattern to a single location along the harbor where two logistics nodes sat close enough together that disrupting both simultaneously would cascade failure across the eastern supply chain within hours. That was where Soto would come. Cade moved assets there before dinner and said nothing about why. That evening, Riven found Cyril in the east study still at the desk. The room was warm. The lamp threw a clean circle of light across the work surface. Junie was asleep in the portable crib that had traveled, over the past 3 weeks, from the kitchen to wherever Cyril was working, as if the crib had decided on its own that proximity to Cyril was the correct position. Riven sat down across from him. On the table between them was a handgun from the mansion's secondary cabinet, one of the pieces he'd meant to clean for 2 days. He pulled it toward him and began. Field strip. Check the components. Wipe down. His hands knew the process completely without his brain. You should know how to use this, Riven said. Not because I think you'll need to, because in the next few days you should have the option. Cyril was quiet for a moment. All right, he said. Riven talked him through it. Weight of the magazine. Angle of the release. The tactile cues for correct seating. He kept his voice even and descriptive, the same tone he'd use walking someone through any technical process. Cyril's hands moved through each step with a precision and confidence that told Riven, with certainty, that this was not new territory for him. But Cyril said nothing about that, and Riven asked nothing. At one point Riven reached across the table to guide Cyril's thumb into the correct position on the grip. Their hands overlapped completely. Neither pulled away quickly. Riven's hand stayed over Cyril's, one hand covering both. For several seconds past what the instruction required. The lamplight, the silence of the study. Junie's small, steady breathing from the crib 2 feet away. All of it creating a stillness that had a specific texture, the kind of stillness that is not empty but full. I hate violence, Cyril said. His voice was level. But underneath it was something that had weight and history. Riven kept his hand where it was. My father built his whole career on the idea that violence was a failure of imagination, Cyril said. That if you understood a conflict fully enough, mapped it completely from both sides, there was always a path that didn't require destruction. He believed that. He built systems based on it. He paused. I spent years trying to believe it too. And now? Riven asked. Cyril set the gun down carefully on the table. His hands rested beside it. He turned his face slightly away, toward the corner of the room, toward nothing. Now, he said, I hate violence, and I hate losing the people I care about more. He said it plainly. No ceremony around it. No softening and no edge. Just the fact of it, stated with the clean and load-bearing weight of something that had been true for a long time and had finally found the right moment to be said aloud. Riven's hand was still over his. He didn't move it. Outside, the rain had started again. Just a presence, just the soft sound of it on the study windows. Junie breathed. The lamp held its circle of light. And in the space between Riven's silence and Cyril's stillness, something settled into place that hadn't been there before and couldn't be taken back. Chapter 9. The night the harbor burned. The ambush came on a Friday at 3:47 in the morning. The window Cyril's reconstruction had identified as optimal low visibility, tide timing that complicated waterside approach detection, the maximum gap between the Calder security rotation's 2-hour shift handoff, arrived exactly when he had predicted it would. The teams had been in position since midnight. Torin had made that call himself. He had read Cyril's 4-day timeline on Tuesday, sat with it for 40 minutes, and then told Riven they were going in 3 hours early and holding. Because optimal windows have margins, and he was not in the business of finding out what the margin was by being late to his own defense. The first movement came from the eastern dock. 2 vehicles, running without lights, approaching the secondary logistics node at the harbor's bend. They moved with the specific confidence of people executing a plan they believed the other side didn't know about. They were 20 meters from the facility entrance when the Calder teams that had been in position for 3 hours and 40 minutes activated simultaneously. It was thorough. It was fast. Cyril had predicted not just the location but the layered approach. Eastern vehicles as the visible threat, a distraction team from the south time to fracture defensive attention, and the real strike coming in from the water on the western side during the 2 to 3 minutes when the eastern response would be consuming the most focus. Riven had countered by treating all 3 vectors as primary from the start and had given each team sealed instructions that were not opened until activation. No communication between team leads before activation. No briefings that could travel. The eastern vehicles were contained in 4 minutes. The southern distraction team arrived to find their entry position already occupied. When Soto's primary force moved in from the water, they found an empty facility. Everything of value had been relocated 48 hours prior, and exterior positions that had been waiting for them for hours. It was not a prolonged fight, but Soto was not with his forces. He never was. Cyril had written this on page 4 of his notes in tighter handwriting than the rest, the handwriting of someone making sure a specific point didn't get lost in everything around it. Soto leads from architecture, not presence. He builds the structure and watches from a removed position. He will have an exit staged before the first team moves. They swept the perimeter. At the eastern harbor wall, they found footprints, 2 sets, departing, and a short-range communications relay that had been active and was now dead, disconnected cleanly and deliberately before the runner left. Not cut. Powered down in sequence. Professional. Soto had been close enough to watch the opening of his own operation and far enough to be gone before the first shot was fired. By 5 in the morning the field was cleared and held. By 5:15, Riven stood at the harbor wall with rain on his face and the cold water smell coming off the channel and the specific satisfaction of a decisive outcome mixing badly with the specific frustration of missing the one thing that mattered most. Kate called. He went out through the north marina. Boat was prepositioned. We lost him at the main channel. Coast Guard contact tried to intercept, but he had a second boat running interference. Our people. 3 injuries, all stable. None critical. A pause. Riven. He knew we'd be ready. He pulled back faster than the operation called for. He had exit triggers set from the beginning. The moment the eastern vehicles were contained, the whole thing folded. He tested us. He tested our response time. He learned our activation speed and our team positioning. Cade's voice was controlled but not neutral. He's going to use that information. Riven walked back to his car. He needed to get to the mansion. He needed to be in the same room as Cyril and know the man was untouched and uncompromised before he could think about the next step. He was reaching for the car door when his secondary watch contact called in. Mr. Calder, there's a man outside the shelter. Been there since roughly 4:15. He's not threatening anything, he's just standing there. He's aware of the camera positions. He positioned himself in the gap between primary angles. Riven's hand tightened on the phone. Description. Older man. Late 50s, maybe. Gray at the temples. Raincoat, good quality. He's not pretending he doesn't know where the cameras are. He's standing in the gap on purpose, which means he knew the layout before he arrived. Stay on him. Do not approach. He told the driver to take him to the shelter. When he arrived, the man was gone. But there was something on the shelter steps. A piece of paper, folded twice, held against the wind by a flat gray stone placed on top of it. His team swept it before he touched it. No chemical signature. No device. No adhesive or secondary material. Just paper. He unfolded it. For words, written in a hand he didn't recognize. Ask the blind one. He stood on the wet steps under the pre-dawn sky and read those 4 words 3 times. Then he put the note in his jacket pocket and got back in the car. Cyril was awake when he arrived at the mansion. He was at the kitchen table with Junie against his chest. She must have woken during the night and he'd brought her down rather than leave her upstairs, and a cup of tea on the table that had gone cold. When the door opened, his head came up immediately. His whole body oriented toward the sound of Riven's footsteps. Reading the pace, the weight, the information that a person's walk carries without their knowing it. You're all right, Cyril said. Not a question. We're all right. Riven sat down across from him. He took the folded note from his pocket and set it flat on the table. Cyril reached out without being told. 2 fingertips moved across the surface of the paper. feeling the indentation of the handwriting, the pressure and angle of each stroke, reading it the way he read everything physical, with the same attention other people gave to reading the words themselves. His fingers slowed on the second pass. Stopped. Junie shifted in his arms. The kitchen was quiet. "Cyril," Riven said carefully, "do you recognize the writing?" Cyril's thumb pressed flat against the paper. His jaw had gone tight. "I've known this handwriting since I was 7 years old," he said. His voice was even. Completely even, which was its own kind of signal. "My father crossed his sevens. He picked it up from his father, who grew up in Lyon. It was the only European habit he ever kept." Riven said nothing. "Aurelio Soto didn't build his Eastern Division alone," Cyril said. "He had someone who designed the structural framework for him in the early years. The supply chain logic, the financial architecture, the approach to territorial management that gave the operation its durability." He set his hand flat on the table beside the note. "That person was paid to disappear when the framework was complete. And they did." "Your father," Riven said. "My father worked with Soto," Cyril said, "before I was old enough to understand what that meant. And then he walked away from it, or tried to, and the accident happened, and every record of our family was erased." He paused. "That note was not written by Soto. Soto doesn't know that phrase. That phrase is from my father." He stopped. "Which means my father is alive. And he was standing outside the shelter tonight." Chapter 10. What the Vale Name Carries. The silence after those words lasted long enough to mean something. Riven sat across the table and said nothing for nearly a full minute. The kitchen held the specific quiet of a house at 5 in the morning. Not peaceful exactly, but suspended. Everything in it waiting. Junie breathed against Cyril's chest with the uncomplicated steadiness of a baby who has learned that wherever Cyril is, the world is fine. Outside the windows, the city was turning from night to pre-dawn. That specific gray that isn't darkness anymore but isn't light yet either. Then Riven said, "Tell me," and Cyril did. He laid it out the way he laid everything out, from the beginning in order without editorializing, with only the facts and the clean logic that connected them. Devlin Vale. What he had built for Soto in the early years. The alliance he had worked for before and after. The morning he disappeared. The accident 3 days later. The erasure of every record. The 9 years of silence in which Cyril had rebuilt his life from the floor up and made himself useful and never, not once, gone looking for what had happened. "Why not?" Riven asked. It was the right question. Cyril was quiet with it for a moment. "Because looking means being visible," he said. "And I had people who needed me to still be standing. The shelter. Junie. The work." He paused. "My father raised me to understand that certain kinds of knowledge attract certain kinds of attention. I had that knowledge. I didn't know how much I had or what it covered. But I knew enough to know that staying small and staying useful was safer than searching for answers. But Soto found you anyway. Soto found me when I became connected to your family," Cyril said. "The Calder name made me visible in a context he monitors. Which means his interest in me is recent. 6 months, maybe a little more. But the handwriting on that note is my father's. Which means Devlin Vale has known where I am for longer than Soto has." Riven pushed back from the table. He stood and moved to the window, not looking out, just kneading his body in motion while his mind worked through the geometry of it. He turned back. "Your father is alive. He's been watching you. And tonight he chose to leave a note rather than approach. He left it where he knew I would get it," Cyril said. "At the shelter. My shelter. He's known about it for a while. And he chose a note instead of a direct contact because a direct contact would have been a risk, to him or to me or to the people in the building. He chose the method that carried the least exposure for everyone." He turned his face toward Riven's direction. "That's how he thinks. Always the minimum necessary action to achieve the necessary communication." Cade appeared in the kitchen doorway. He had been awake in the second-floor office for the past 2 hours and had been listening on the house intercom, which was an invasion of privacy that he would not apologize for because the information was too important and he had made that calculation the moment the conversation started. "The Alliance," Kate said, stepping fully into the room. "The one your father worked for before and after Soto. You said he had a shorthand for them. A name he used privately." Cyril turned toward his voice. "He only used it when he thought I was asleep," Cyril said. 2 words. He said it to himself when he was working. The way people talk to themselves when they think no one can hear them. He said the 2 words. Cade went very still. Torin appeared in the doorway behind him. He had been in the hallway, closer than any of them had known, which meant he had been listening long enough to have made a decision about being present. The look that passed between the brothers in the 2 seconds after Cyril spoke was not a look that required translation. It was the look of 2 people who have just heard something that connects 2 separate bodies of information they've been holding apart for a long time. "We know that name," Torin said. "I know," Cade said. "Where?" Riven asked. Cade crossed to the table. He had the folder from upstairs. He'd brought it when he came down, which meant he'd already been thinking about this before Cyril said the words. He opened it to the 3rd page and set it flat. The financial trace. The backward trace, the dormant structure. The last active transaction dated 6 months before the Vale family disappeared. At the top of the page, circled in pen, the same 2 words Cyril had just spoken. The kitchen went completely quiet. All 4 of them looked at the page, at the circle, at the date of the last transaction. Junie made a small sound, not distressed, just briefly awake, and Cyril pressed his lips to her head automatically. Still looking in the direction of the table, still processing. Riven sat back down. His hand found Cyril's on the table and closed around it. Openly, without looking around to see who was watching, without the half-step back that had qualified every previous contact between them. Just his hand around Cyril's. Present. Cyril's fingers closed in return. "What does this mean?" Riven asked. He looked at Cade. "It means the structure that paid to erase the Vale family and the structure that your family has been navigating around for the past 3 years are the same entity," Cade said. "They've been the same entity the whole time. We just didn't have the connection point." He paused. "Cyril is the connection point. And Soto," Torin said from the doorway. "Where does Soto fit?" "Soto is downstream," Cyril said. Everyone turned toward him. He was still facing the table. Still holding Riven's hand. "He built his Eastern Division using my father's architectural framework. But the people who funded the early expansion, the ones who made it viable at scale, were the Alliance. Soto owes his infrastructure to them, which means he's not fully independent. He never was. He answers to something above him. And that something," Cade said, "wants to know how much you know." "About the framework," Cyril said. "The original architecture my father built. There are things in that structure that only Devlin Vale would know, the specific logic of it, the backdoors he built into it, the pressure points where the whole thing becomes fragile if you know where to push. If Devlin is unreachable and they can't get to him, they come for you," Riven said. "Because he raised me in that house," Cyril said. "Because he talked to me. Because a man like my father, who understood that knowledge is infrastructure, would have made sure someone he trusted carried certain information without knowing they were carrying it." He paused. "And they're right. He did. I just didn't know which parts of what he told me were the parts that mattered until I started sitting in these briefings and listening to Cade's intelligence and watching the pattern." Torin walked fully into the kitchen and pulled out a chair. Sat down. It was the first time in weeks that his expression had shifted out of controlled tension and into something with forward motion in it. "What do you know?" he asked Cyril. "I know how the Eastern Division's supply chain is structured at its foundation," Cyril said. "Not the current operations, those have evolved. But the underlying logic that everything else was built on top of. The load-bearing architecture." He paused. "And I know where it breaks." The room held that for a moment. "My father didn't tell me this as information," Cyril said. "He told me through examples, problems he'd solved, decisions he'd made. He used to walk me through strategic scenarios the way some fathers teach their kids chess, as exercises, as puzzles. He wasn't briefing me. He was training me to think. But the problems he used were real. He stopped. And I remember every one of them. They worked until noon. By the time the session broke, the outline of a counter-strategy existed. Built from Cyril's knowledge of the original architecture, Cade's intelligence, Torin's operational capability, and Riven's understanding of the territory. Not complete. There were gaps, variables that needed more information. But the shape was there, and the shape was strong, and none of it was what Soto would be expecting. If you know how something was built, you know exactly where it comes apart. And Cyril knew. That afternoon, Riven stood at the kitchen window while Cyril fed Junie at the counter behind him. The city was fully awake. Sunlight on wet pavement after the night's rain, delivery routes running. The ordinary business of a city that had no idea what had happened at its harbor 12 hours earlier. He turned around. Cyril had one hand on Junie's back and his face turned slightly toward the light from the window. Not seeing it, just feeling the warmth of it on his skin. He did that sometimes. Turned toward warmth. Riven crossed the kitchen. He stopped in front of Cyril. He reached out slowly, no rush in it, nothing to prove, and took Cyril's free hand in both of his. Not guiding him, not reaching past him for something else. Just holding his hand, openly, in the middle of the kitchen in daylight, with both brothers somewhere in the building and Junie awake and the city moving outside. Cyril didn't pull away. He didn't look toward Riven in the directed way that sometimes stood in for looking at him. He just turned his hand slightly in Riven's hold and let his fingers close. Not tightly, just real. Riven stayed there. Junie made a content sound against Cyril's chest and grabbed a fistful of his shirt. The moment lasted. And then, in the East Wing office, Cade's phone lit up. He read the message. His face went still. He typed a one-word response, stood up, and walked down the hall. He stopped outside the kitchen doorway, looked at his brother and Cyril in the afternoon light, and made a decision about timing that lasted exactly 3 seconds before he stepped through the door. Riven. Riven looked up. Soto sent a message, Cade said. Encrypted, routed through a relay we weren't supposed to be able to trace. He used the relay because he wanted us to trace it, eventually. He wanted us to know it came from him. He held up his phone. One sentence. He read it aloud. Tell the blind heir of Vale. The past isn't finished with him yet. The kitchen went still. Riven's hand tightened around Cyril's. Cyril stood with it for a moment. His jaw was set and his posture was the composed stillness that had been his default since before Riven had known him. But under it, something had changed. The stillness of a man who has just received the confirmation he spent 9 years half expecting and has now decided what to do with it. He looked toward the window. Toward the light. Good, he said. Torin's voice came from the hallway. Good, good, Cyril said again. He turned back toward the room, toward all of them, toward the family he had walked into through a door that was set as a test and had never walked back out of. Because now we know exactly what we're dealing with. And we know exactly where it comes apart. He shifted Junie to his other shoulder. So we stop waiting for the next move. We go find my father. And then we finish this. He said it the way his father used to say certain things, with the clean and absolute certainty of someone who has done the math, checked it twice, and is ready to show their work. And the question that remained, the one that settled into that kitchen like a fourth person in the room, quiet and patient and not in any hurry, because it had already waited 9 years, was not whether Cyril Vale was ready for what was coming. The question was whether what was coming was ready for him.